So much for coming to our panel discussion on art to activism. Revolution is more than a one-time event. I keep saying thing, I don't know why. I think I want it to be more, I don't know what that means. But in any case, we're really excited to have you guys here, and we're really excited to have you here. And I was going to stand here and read your amazing bios, but I think I'd rather just have you guys tell a little bit about yourselves and your history before we start. So I will say that we have with us today Ellyzabeth. Oh my gosh, I almost said Ellyzabeth Taylor. Her spirit is in the room, right? Hey, talk about art to activism. She's definitely with us today. There we go. Ellyzabeth Adler with Chicago Dance Theatre, and Willa Taylor, Director of Education and Community Outreach. Engagement. Thank you so much with the Goodman. Jamil, Khoury, Artistic Director with Silk Road Theatre Project. Silk Road Rising, yes. Gosh, I'm so prepared. Maren Rosenberg, who is an artist in residence who we just commandeered because she did a couple years of really fantastic work in Palestine, and activism is really a part of everything that she does as an artist. And Tony Adams, Artistic Director of Halcyon Theatre, will be moderating the panel and asking questions and stuff like that. So, if you wouldn't mind, Ellyzabeth, if we could just start with you, just go down the row and sort of give us a little bit about what you're about. That'd be great.
Yeah. There's a lot I could say, but to get down to the nitty-gritty of it, I'm Ellyzabeth Adler. I am the Executive Director and Founder for Chicago Dance Theatre Ensemble, and we are a multidisciplinary performing arts ensemble and outreach organization that creates work in the genre of dance theatre, which, as Rudolf von Bonn says, is the uniting force of all the arts to create a change in humankind. I grew up as a ballet dancer and then retired at the whopping age of 20 to go to college. And, through there is when I started finding my voice as being a multidisciplinary artist. But activism has always been in my blood. My father was diagnosed 3 years before I existed in this world with multiple sclerosis. And my parents grew up fighting for the ADA laws and also for veterans with disabilities as well. And so I would, as a 7-year-old, go to various different senators' offices and not really know what's going on, but was totally a part of it all. And so activism for me is not separate from arts as well. And I've had the opportunity to, through not only the stage work that we create, whether it's actually, I love the fact that T.S. Eliot's on here, because the very first piece that we ever adapted for the stage was The Wasteland. But then also other performance work that I've created with most recently was Unraveling Bill, which is based on a soldier who came back from Iraq and 6 months later committed suicide. And it's been really wonderful being able to bring this story to life and to share the story, because whether it's people who have just dealt with depression or family members that they know, or even just dealing with soldiers and the causes and effects of war, using art as a platform to create and to engage, to me, is just the greatest thing in the world. Getting a chance to create and change the world every single day. And so that's a little bit about me.
Well, I'm Willa Taylor. I'm the Director of Education and Engagement at the Goodman Theatre, which means multiple things on different days. But like Ellyzabeth, I got started as an activist very early in my life. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, which at the time was segregated. My mother, who was a school teacher, was on strike, trying to get schools desegregated in Texas. My grandmother, who was an activist from way back, took me to sit-ins and demonstrations from the time that I was 4. So it is very much a part of my blood. I started working professionally in theater when I was a senior in high school as an actor, and quickly found that I had absolutely no talent. But fortunately, went to college and discovered Backstage and back-of-house work, production, and became a stage manager and a producer and a lot of other things, although they refused to let me in the costume shop, close to a needle. I have worked in theater, frankly, off and on ever since my senior year of high school, which was a very, very long time ago, and really cannot separate the difference between art and activism. I think art is activism in the same way that art is education, and am trying basically to save the world by practicing that philosophy.
I love that we're saving the world.
Yes!
Superheroes are so
wake up in the
right.
morning.
Needs a lot of work.
Yes. I'm Jamil Khoury. I am the founding artistic director of Silk Road Rising. Silk Road was founded out of a strong activist impulse. My life partner, who's seated right here, Malik Galani, who's our executive director, we founded the company in response to the attacks of September 11th, 2001. And specifically the anti-Arab and anti-Muslim climate that gripped the country after the attacks and has continued to play itself out in all sorts of ways. Malik is originally from Pakistan, is Muslim. My father is from Syria, I'm half Arab. And so initially we were really looking at Arab world and Islamic world, but kept running into references to the historic Silk Road, these trade routes that stretched from China to Syria or Japan to Italy if you include the sea routes. Everyone knows the Silk Road? So, excuse me. So we thought, here's a model of polyculturalism. Is that a term familiar? As opposed, yes.
Actually, if you wouldn't mind, maybe a brief sentence, if that's possible,
Sure.
about the difference between multicultural and polycultural would be helpful.
Yeah, I think we feel very much part of a sort of polycultural movement within theater and the arts. And what distinguishes the two schools, if you will, multiculturalism, places an emphasis on the sort of mosaic of cultures that exists within a given society, which is a great thing. And so you're accentuating specific experiences, be that Asian American or African American or LGBT or women's experiences. I am a true believer in multiculturalism and the sort of intent and the intentions behind the multicultural project, let's say. Polyculturalism is about the intersection and the overlapping of cultures and how cultures meet each other, sometimes collide into each other, but ultimately impact and somehow change. And the idea is that the Silk Road, where you had, of course, these trade routes, but you also had this traditional storytelling, so stories being translated from Mandarin to Hindi to Farsi to Arabic to Turkish to Greek and so forth. There was also filtering through cultural prisms and also, historical eras. We wanted to bring that to Chicago in a very 21st century diasporic way. So the stories of Americans of Silk Road backgrounds and this engagement with American culture and other cultures. So hence polyculturalism is kind of a strong activist commitment of the company, let's say.
That's the last question.
No.
Hi everybody, I'm Maren Rosenberg. I'm an artist in residence with Halcyon. I am incredibly overwhelmed to be on stage with such incredibly prestigious people. I am but a mere player. I'm an actor. I also have published a play which has now been performed in both Arabic and English, based off of the experiences of a Western woman then going to Palestine, which is where I spent quite a number of my past 5 years. I worked with several theater companies out there. Pretty much, and again, interestingly enough, I grew up in a household which never told me I was doing something that was of activist nature. It just was the way things were. You didn't like something, you went and you told somebody about it, which might include going downtown and holding a sign. My mother is from Chicago, worked with Martin Luther King during the civil rights movement. My father came from a very different background as Rosenberg, I'll let you guess, and was part of the institutions. He was one of the first Jews who was accepted to Exeter and things of that nature. So always it was in my nature at least to ask questions, and when the issue came up of Israel, Palestine, and all of that, I guess as an artist and just as sort of with my insatiable curiosity, felt prompted not just to sort of go and listen, but then to try to hear stories for myself. I'm a member of the learning disabled community. I'm from Washington, D.C., which we still don't have a vote. So again, just all those different little things inspired me to go sort of poke around probably where I wasn't welcome and wanted all the time. And then the only way I knew how to express that and then continue to share the stories that I found so interesting and moving was to put this in the format that I know best how to communicate in, which is drama and theater. So having never written a play, I just grabbed a bunch of people who I understood to actually know about what they were doing. We sort of developed this project. It ate my life, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. And again, yeah, I'm totally of the mindset that art is education, it is activism. I don't really see how you can unzip the two. Even if, it's just sort of whether or not that's the reason and impetus for getting people into the theater. Once they're in the theater, they're participating in a civil action, they're participating in a community building action. And so I'm still, as much as I know, I'm also still learning and growing. But again, it's never been something that's always been very conscious. It's just kind of something that is, and something that's there.
It's kind of funny, my family was also activists in nature, however, on the other end of the spectrum, where my great-grandfather was one of the founders of the NRA. And my grandfather and my father are very into land rights and stuff, but it's the exact opposite wing. So I guess the first question, I'll just throw some out there, and then as we go, Taylor, some. But art's been a part of the movement for social change in Chicago since at least 1899 or 1889, when Jane Addams founded the Hull House. And her idea was art for the exaltation of the masses, that art makes you a better person, therefore makes a better community. And I guess the first question is, how has that idea changed in the last 125 years since that for you guys?
I think it's dropped out of the school system. In my own personal opinion, when we, as people who produce performances, are complaining about the dying audience and people not coming to it, and the fact that the majority of the people sitting in the seats are either fellow artists or, especially on smaller theater level, and even to get up to a bigger state, you need this mass marketing for other people to come in. And I blame the education system flat out. Right now, they're still talking about doing arts in the schools, but they're really only talking about musical and visual art, and that's because you can sit in a chair. And as someone that teaches dance, theater, and movement, part of the reason why the kids end up hitting each other and all stuff is because they do not have the kinesthetic awareness for their body. And one of the biggest things that Jane Addams was about was actually getting kids up and doing things. It's a whole play-based model for learning. And I think that we, over the years, in the general community, have devalued ourselves as artists. And just, we have to keep creating this stuff, but we're not putting an emphasis on it. And I think it would be really awesome if we ever got to the day in which we were turning out kids that were artists, like the way that we're turning out basketball stars or football stars. But it has to start with education.
So one of the things with her, she was very much operating from a pretty high place of privilege. She was affluent from day one. And that's one of the things that is different now, it seems, is the perception of how privilege plays out in art has been examined more. Do you think we have farther to go with that, or do you think we're making baby steps?
Well, that presumes that there's not indigenous art in cultures that don't necessarily have a lot of money. And I think the problem is less about people who have privilege and their involvement in the art than it is this sort of categorization of particular forms of creation and creativity as the right kind of art, or the professional art, or the professional arts in theater, and sort of always a negative connotation when we say community work. I think that absolutely there's a problem with the schools, but I'd also say that there's a problem with community, and what community needs these days too is problematic and has been factored in that doesn't allow us to really sort of look to the creative energies in a place to make change.
So it might be an assumption that we're all on the same page about art and activism, the relationship between the two. One thing that we've dealt with quite a bit since starting the Silk Road has been a challenge to that assumption, that art exists to sort of reinforce and celebrate the status quo. And that can oftentimes be, how power dynamics play themselves out. Now, obviously, we reject that, but we've had this conversation many times with leaders of communities that we represent on our stage in one form or another, and so we're always engaging, community leadership and grassroots activists and so forth about, what art means to Chinese immigrants or to Indian immigrants or immigrants from the Middle East. And oftentimes we're told we want to see ourselves in a good light. We want celebratory work. We want self-esteem building work. Isn't it great to be Korean, or isn't it great to be? And we always sort of come back with this idea, but we want to go deeper. We want to go further. We want to sort of probe identity markers and meanings and so forth. And we get a lot of pushback. And I'm not saying that every argument we counter isn't a valid argument, but it's a very different argument. And it's an argument that really calls into question the assumption that we're operating under.
So how do you think, what do you think the difference is between activist art and more traditionally recognized forms of activism and protest? Is there a different impulse guiding art as activism than marching in the streets?
Ironically, we were just having this discussion this morning because we're in the process, as you have to, being a company, rewriting vision and examining all that. So just came from a lovely workshop about that. The website will be updated by the end of the month. Just on that push there. But we were talking about this because one of the things that we do push on is social justice. Well, what does social justice mean? What does political theater mean? And unfortunately, we were examining what the actual definitions were coming from, like the Greek terminology of what political actually means and what does society actually mean. And unfortunately, I think that we pigeonholed it into everything as just being part of government. And it's not. And I think also as an arts organization, this is something we discussed this morning, as an arts organization, it is just about the questions. And sometimes we don't need to be on the side of either or. It is just sometimes about engaging the audience to get them to think for themselves. And this, I actually go back to the education in schools, because one of our key components is establishing critical thinking skills within our youth. Because what that does, especially for at-risk youth, which is primarily who we work with, it instills in them lifelong learning quests and social and civic engagement. And for us, it's not about taking a stand on one way or the other. And I think sometimes we've had pushback also from both critics, media, and audience about, well, you should be more feminist, or you should be more, anti-this, or more this or that. And it's like, no, why can't we just talk about it and have a dialogue? And then you're allowed to go and have your own opinion, out there. And I don't know, like for me, I try to separate me going to say like NATO and what Ellyzabeth Adler is as the artist, and maybe that's just my own personal thing too, because I am also active also in the interfaith world as well. I personally don't feel I need to bring that to stage all the time. There's always going to be a component of that, but that is my own personal choice as a personal person. If that makes any sense.
Well, I guess in kind of a follow-up to that, in the nature of, does that make sense? How do you define at-risk? I always think that's one of those terms that everybody thinks they know, like the human condition, but nobody ever actually says what it means. So for you, what does at-risk actually mean?
At-risk for me is, first of all, kids who live in poverty. 99% of the kids that we work with at our schools are at or below the poverty level. At-risk for me is also, being in a gang-infested neighborhood. At-risk for me is also kids who are stuffed in classrooms with 37 kids, and they're in second grade.
Yes, the next question is for Jamil. How does an audience factor into your work? How overtly are you geared for an audience? And kind of the secondary follow-up, how do you avoid just preaching to the choir or art on board?
Well, the preaching to the choir, I'll address that first. In our programming, obviously we have our own political convictions and political commitments and beliefs and so forth, but I'm very careful about not selecting plays that would be seen as didactic or polemical or somehow directing an audience or feeding you a conclusion or feeding you a politics. So that's always a huge red flag for me when coming across a play, and I come across a lot of those plays. So we respect the audience, we respect the intelligence of the audience, and we assume that the audience can arrive at their own conclusions. Of course, I'm forgetting the first part of your question.
How overtly are you thinking about the audience when you're creating the work?
We've had this kind of bifurcated audience development challenge really since day one. It's been reaching out to Silver Road communities and trying to turn a lot of non-theater goers into theater goers, and also working with the mainstream theater-going audience. And so we have a bit of a schizophrenia going on in terms of how we're speaking to audience, because we're always aware that that's such a fragmented idea. Obviously you want a piece that's going to engage as many people as possible, but by the same token, we don't want to dumb down work. We don't want to steer clear of controversy. We don't want to worry about who we're offending. I mean, I always I always maintain that if I'm not offending anyone, I'm not doing my job. So somehow I should be, alienating and upsetting people. We love those walkouts, that said, you want to also create space that people feel safe enough to enter and to engage with ideas and to engage with each other. So I think it's a constant balancing act, and I think that if we proceed with the belief that audiences are smart and audiences are capable and audiences don't need us to baby them or hold their hands, we see oftentimes the results that we want to see, which is creating dialogue.
And I think that we can't be afraid of the controversy that may ensue. And part of what I find disturbing is a sense that anytime someone says something negative about it, or challenges or pushes back in any way, that's problematic. And I think that first, that attitude does not allow theater, which I think personally is a very sacred space, to be a safe space as well. Because if I can't, it's one of the few places I think that's left in our society where people of very divergent views can come and have a shared experience and talk about the discord between the way they see things. And if we can't do that because we're afraid that the review will be bad or that we'll have to answer letters from the subscribers all day the next day after a post show, then I think that's a real problem. I think it's a real problem.
And perhaps this is a small digression, but it links very nicely. You had asked earlier where you sort of attributed some of the fall away from, theater and art and prestige. In American culture, I've noticed particularly, there is this emphasis on being a master. And you only do, it's like, I am a flamenco dancer, I will never invade your ballerina, because you know how to do ballet and I know how to do flamenco, and we'll get up on stage, but we'd never even consider discussing how one another does their work. And there's some of that in the audiences as well. So even just the act of bringing together people from different groups. So you get your Silk Road audience and you get the person who has the subscription to every single theater, and you actually get them physically sat next to one another in a theater is a huge community building gift that the theater has. And it's also, again, one of the last live arts, dance and physical theater, where we're actually physically still in the space. It's not edited later, it's not photoshopped, it's not perfect or exactly what you wanted it to be. And I find that there's just less and less and less of that. Being someone who grew up in the United States, and then getting to go to other countries and cultures where there's a lot more of that, a lot more street performance and live performance, you're giving people this gift of seeing things that are not perfect, they're not glossed over, and they're real. And when the actor drops the cup and there's that moment of, was that meant to happen? You're all engaged. And it doesn't matter if you have a subscription to the Lyric or you're the kid from Khoury. You guys are all in that moment together, and I think that's one of the things that's really important.
And I think the other thing that separates America from the rest of the world is that we're so good at classifying ourselves, and we have to classify ourselves in order to feel safe. And I think as artists, we create from a pure place of vulnerability. And so you're going to have someone that tells you that what you did on stage was crap, and then you're going to have somebody else that just told you that was just the most amazing thing. And, as an artist, you have to develop your own truth behind it, and try not to waver, but also still to try to continue to grow, because if you stay classified within something, then you yourself as a person, as an artist, does not grow. And I think that it's really interesting too, talking about the idea of polyculturalism, because I think the really cool thing about being in Chicago versus Milwaukee, where I grew up, is that we are so much more polycultural. I love the fact that in my neighborhood, I can go walk and get Cuban, I can go get Thai, I can go to the grocery store and get olive oil from all around the world, and I think that's awesome.
Right, but that's a level of privilege.
Exactly, it is.
Depending on where
and
you
that's
are,
what I
you
think,
can't do that.
exactly, and that's where I think that what happens is because then I go back to where I'm originally from, and in some of these small towns within Wisconsin, and they're afraid, because then that would have to be a push of a boundary. I had a family member, for instance, who had a problem that the grocery store asked for both Spanish and English on the ATM card, or the debit slider thingy. And to me, it's just wow, we're afraid to push boundaries. But I think what's really cool about theater and film and adding all that in there, is that it opens up the audience. And I think actually it's really great what you guys are doing, the fact that you're trying to do a lot of this website in place, because it brings it in and it brings it expanding outside, And I know that the Illinois Arts Council has been trying hard to bring the arts to, other smaller parts of, Illinois that doesn't necessarily get the arts as well. But it goes also a step further, because then you have to really try to promote and educate yourself, or the other audiences and the adults. And because we've taken arts education outside of the schools and they don't have it anymore, people don't have a basis to understand. And so the reason why they're able to go see a football game or a basketball game is because there's something that they're familiar with. And people are afraid with being unfamiliar with something because they feel like they might get tucked onto. And that's where, community engagement, I feel, is part of activism as well.
I guess kind of to backtrack a little bit, but also kind of continue on that mode. Willa, you brought up indigenous art earlier, and you mentioned some of the street art you saw when you were in Jerusalem. One of the things that for me I think is kind of an obvious difference between outsider art, indigenous art, all the different art forms, and capital A art as an industry, is the building that's attached with it. And I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts on what changes when you move art into a building, whether it's solid walls like this or a palace, as opposed to doing it in a field or in an alley or in a public place. What's different about art in a building?
Well, I don't think it starts with the four walls. I think it starts with the terminology. So who decides what's art, outsider art? So outsider art, which has now become commodified in a way, is like saying community-based theater. It's a way of categorizing that, frankly, I don't think has anything to do with safety and all about sort of setting boundaries in keeping people out, not allowing people access. I think the difference with the walls is that walls usually have doors attached so that you can control who comes in and who gets a say within the walls, which is often problematic, because then it creates, even though I believe that theater is a sacred space, I don't necessarily believe that a theater is a temple. And so the ability for people to engage when I am sitting on the bus stop and doing some kind of performance where anybody can come up and interact with me, and the difference when I have to pay $78, $50, or $175, or $375, which they're asking to go see the Michael Jackson Cirque du Soleil piece,
It's like a
makes
mortgage
it
payment.
exclusionary in a way that doesn't allow people in. And I have to say, you don't have to go back to Wisconsin or to rural Illinois to find communities that have no access to the arts. There's a huge desert between sort of the end of the loop, end of the South Loop, going south and west in Chicago alone that has no, if you look at the map that the city has put together around sort of arts organizations and where they are, there's a huge swath of the city where there's absolutely nothing.
And the red line is packed.
That's, yeah.
The red line is covered. For you, Jamil, how, kind of along the same lines, how is the online stuff you're doing now different from the stuff?
Well, it's very much a response to sort of the bricks and mortar constraints of doing theater. Who is going to come to the Chicago Temple building to see one of our plays? And obviously you have to live in greater Chicagoland unless you're a tourist, and you have to have the ability to get to the Loop and the means to see a play, even though, we make a big point of selling a lot of reduced price tickets and so forth. That's something we feel very committed to. Online work is really a response to questions that we were getting, emails that we were getting from the early days of the company, primarily from women, primarily Muslim women living in Europe, who somehow would come upon our website. And they were very intrigued by the issues that we were grappling with as a theater company, and they wanted some sort of access, and they wanted to be involved. There's a woman in Birmingham, England, who's actually a big piece of her thesis is the Silk Road story, and so her and I have been in conversation for a few years now. We wanted to create accessibility, and we looked at the internet as this incredibly democratic, in theory very egalitarian. So long as you have access to a computer, you can access content. And we wanted to make some of our art accessible, and in a way that it was interactive, in a way that we were engaging people in a conversation, in a dialogue. So now we are developing a play online with input from a virtual audience, and it's a way of making the virtual audience sort of co-creators in a new play development process, but also a civic engagement process, because it deals with resistance to the building of mosques and communities across the U.S., this particular project. So I think the internet offers us an opportunity that's unprecedented. We didn't have that in the 4,000-year, however many thousands of years history of live theater.
So can you talk a little bit more about that process?
Sure.
Are you actually taking input in terms of the script from people online, or?
That's a great question. It's an 8-step process, and the third step was the 6 characters, the actors in character, doing 4 video blogs each.
That you had already created, or that came from?
That I created in collaboration with the actors.
Okay.
And then we posed questions to the virtual audience about each vlog.
Okay.
And then we allowed the virtual audience to pose questions to us. So they're either posing a question to me, or they're posing a question to the character.
Mm-hmm.
And now we are in what's called the conflict scene stage, which is taking pairings of characters and creating 2 character video blogs. So there will be a total of 9. We've released 6 of them. And so these are creating relational dynamics between characters, and also conflicts and tensions that exist between characters. Now, they're not scenes that are going to be plopped into a final play.
Okay.
They are scenes that inform the writing of the play.
Okay.
And so we are then, each time we release a scene, we pose questions and also take questions from a virtual audience. And what we find is that plays itself out on 2 levels: those who engage online, or those who engage me privately, through private email. I have found it as a playwright to be an amazing experience, because I'm getting all these insights and ideas that I hadn't considered. Some of them I just sort of dismiss, and others are really quite helpful because, of course, we all bring our own, subjective lens and baggage and knowledge, and people will point out sort of, well, I think the mother would have, or I think, this sort of thing, and it's giving me a lot to consciously and subconsciously work on, and it's also it also fuels the workshopping process with the actors in the room, because we can look at comments about characters. We can look at how people are responding. The Charles Baker character, who's the Republican member of the DuPage County Board and is very hostile towards the building of mosques. We've gotten lots of feedback about I hate his politics. I need to like him. Give me something more likable. And so I'm working on actually finding what is more likable about Charles. What within his family life makes him a more sympathetic character. Because I'm working with an actor whose politics are probably to the left of mine on this very right-wing character, and so we're having a lot of fun, but we're not wanting to deny him integrity and credibility and validity.
That's so cool.
I guess the next question I had, when I was going back and rereading stuff so I didn't look like an idiot as my writer, which something I try to do often.
You should have said that stuff to me.
Well, I came across the thing that Owen Kelly, who is a British artist who works with, does a lot of community-based work there, said that was super incendiary, then it kind of fell off. He said the communities with whom we work are not really our customers. They are the raw material upon which we work on behalf of our customers, who are the agencies to whom we sell the reports and documenting evidence of the work. Kind of the idea that we're actually working through communities for funders, for patrons. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Is that something that you see or that you are aware of and consciously avoid? How do you navigate that in your work?
Maren, you look like
Because the fact is the money doesn't come from people you're creating work for and with. How do you navigate that?
I have a very, very different experience of it because I've never been a producer inside the United States, and working in the West Bank, where there's practically no infrastructure to support, the paving of roads in Ramazan, for example. I don't want to say a percentage because I don't have that statistic, but the vast majority of the art created that is then advertised and made hugely public is funded by non-government organizations, NGOs, all with their own mission statement, all with their own buffers and qualifications. There was one time where I was literally, a meeting was over and I was called up and they said, Maren, do you know any plays about the environment? Well, yes, I know a few. Do you know any that are in Arabic? No. Will you make us one? Well, it'll take you some time. Can you do it in a week? We said we'd start our first rehearsal in a week. People are so, and in many ways, and we're in the United States as well. I just heard a report saying to be an artist is one of the hardest professions. People will graduate with these astounding arts degrees.
I heard that, yeah.
It was an
But
NPR
we're not gonna
something,
get a job.
something.
Yeah.
And so, I love that question. What are you going to be when you grow up, Maren? What I am now? No, when you really grow up. But again, we're scrambling and searching for funding, and in that have to then find that you bend and twist into the molds that exist that have the finances and the funding.
And it's also really hard because, especially among funding for education programs, the buzz is all about, wellness programming and all that stuff. So it's like all of a sudden some of these foundations that were doing arts-based are like, oh no, we're just all about wellness right now. And it's just like, okay, you gotta create this program and this, and it's just, it gets hard. And I think what's really important, this goes back to what I was kind of saying earlier, is that as an artist, you have to figure out what your voice is And you have to find that balance of staying connected with that voice. I do feel that I am a conduit for creativity, and that the gift that I was given can be taken away easily. And it has at various points in life. And I am here to also reflect what is going on in my community that I live in, and that global world that I'm a part of. And to me, you're going to find people that agree with you, and you're going to find people that don't agree with you. And if you're kind of always being a mamsy-pamsy about which way to go, you're never going to get anywhere. And it goes to what you were saying, yes, you're always going to piss off somebody, but that's okay. And that's fine, because you've engaged.
I want to add, one of the most frustrating things for us was the drive to institutionalize, and that you're given a sort of blueprint for what that looks like, and a series of steps and hoops that you're supposed to jump through. And so we did it. We sort of, okay, well, we'll do this. We don't really want to, but okay, we'll do this. And at one point we realized that we had essentially lost ourselves. That we were so consumed and so focused on sort of, pleasing the funding community and following these guidelines that we forgot why we were doing what we were doing, or at least we disconnected from it. And we had to actually start a whole process, and it involved strategic planning and outside consulting and so forth to kind of reclaim ourselves and to reclaim our mission, and to be able to go back to the funding community and say, actually, we want to do it this way. And we don't right. We don't know if it'll work. We don't know. We just don't know. And also, how we measure success is really problematic in this sector.
Impact upon your benefit community, direct and indirect.
In 250 characters.
Exactly.
And we had a very similar experience that I was taught to run theaters how the Goodman runs, and that's how you build a theater. And as we got in the process of doing it, I realized that that's a terrible model for a small theater. It's great for the Goodman. It doesn't scale down. So it was, for us, we had that moment where we're like, what the hell are we doing? Yeah. So.
I think that's no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say one last thing again that I noticed in coming from, spending 3.5 of the last 5 years outside in another community. I see the poisoning that funding totally based art has had, and it's sort of wreaked havoc on all members of the community. You were in the West Bank during the Intifada, and I heard great deals about, the community and how difficult it was, but how tightly knit everyone was. People would go out, and now people are like, there's garbage on the street, that's the UN's job. I'm not picking that up. That's the UN's job. If I want a clean street, they're gonna have to pay me to do it. Meanwhile, where are your children supposed to play? The children have to deal with the garbage because now someone else outside has told you that this is a marketable job and you're actually not valuable unless you're getting paid for what you're doing. I met someone who paints these beautiful paintings, and I was like, do you ever sell your work? And he was, no. Why would I do that? Well, you just, okay, you paint. That's an awesome idea, but it's just, now you will find in the same arts communities these people who get involved for the most noble and wholesome of reasons suddenly going, oh no, we won't do that. You need to pay me $150 a day and my transportation or I'm not showing up. Whereas, and then suddenly funding gets cut or something happens, and then these projects which used to be funded after because they were fired by people's passion and dedication to do it regardless are now suddenly, the tiniest withdrawal of financial support unravels the entire thread of the project, and it's gone.
So we go on, you and I go on about this a lot on Facebook. So first of all, as a representative of the Goodman, let me just say that I love our funders. I understand that quote, and I would say in the context of that quote, yes, that's who I work for. in the same way that the hooker with the heart of gold works for customers so that she can feed her family. So it's my job to engage the community across the community spectrum, to allow them access to what we do, to help them understand the value in the context of their own lives of what we do, and get the people who have the privilege and the resources to understand their context in sort of the fabric of all that we do. So what that means is then that I have to do a dance to get the money so that then I can get the people who I really work for to be allowed to have certain things. And I'm not sure that the not-for-profit model in which we work is necessarily sustainable in that way. That perhaps there needs to be something much more entrepreneurial about it, or perhaps the Goodman model, like you talk about, is really only sustainable for perhaps 1 or 5%, and that there has to be some other kind of model to work with. But funders don't necessarily understand that. They only see success and then they want to replicate that and force that replication on other things. I cannot tell you. So we have a summer program that we're in the 5th week of 6 weeks right now. It's 80 kids from all over Chicagoland area. It looks like exactly what the world should look like. Black, white, gay, straight, kids with disabilities, kids with learning disabilities, kids who have a lot of money, kids who have nothing, it's everything in that room. And we took them to see Oedipus Rey at Victory Garden the other night, and there were about 30, I'm sitting in a bar across the street, and I see about 30 of them walking down the street. And I hear these 2 women who are sitting at the bar by me say, "Oh my God, look at that group, they can't be going to the theater." And I thought, where else in the world, other than the theater, or other than in an arts environment, would that group of kids ever have a chance to be together? Now that is not something that I can put in 250 characters on a box when they're asking me about critical thinking skills.
Yes.
Yeah.
So how do I get a funder to understand that that is really the importance of the work, not whether or not that reading score goes up to?
Yes.
And how do you navigate? Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that, you know what, for me, this is like our 11th year of existence, and you know, it's hard because how do you keep it going when you have a mortgage to pay for and you have all of this stuff? And part of my ways of doing it in our model is I still teach within the classroom. And I realize what I absolutely love, because people are always like, oh, you should go teach college. And maybe at some other point in my life, but I love the joy of seeing a 5-year-old use finger paint. It's awesome. And when I was teaching in India, it was really great because there it's like everybody really wants to dance. That's how they tell stories and with their body, because there's like a bazillion different languages in like one little province. And so they use storytelling and they use music to communicate with one another. And when I was there, that's what I reconnected with, was the body as a tool to tell stories with. And you know, part of what I was doing was teaching English through the arts and giving, you know, the girls a chance to write an alphabet book and having them make it with their fingers, and teaching head, shoulders, knees, and toes, and having Tati, who is a 7-year-old musician, doing head, shoulders, knees, and toes with us was like fun because he learned what the word head in English was. And I think, you know, as artists, you know, we have to find the funding, and whether it's private or foundations or individuals, we have to do it, and that's part of the thing, but we have to also figure out how to stay connected. And so for me, staying connected connected is in the classroom and understanding where the pure art comes from that you can't put into 250 characters.
And it's interesting because the idea of connection is different, I think, for everybody here.
Yeah.
Like, Maren, you're artist first. Ellyzabeth, you've kind of migrated to teacher first. Jamil, you kind of sit on that fence. And Willa, your job is to connect the art to the people. How does that inform how you view art? Like, when you yourself are looking at a work, does your differing role of how you connect to people through art change?
I don't know, like for me, you know, sometimes I do take off the teacher hat. Sometimes I am the administrator, sometimes I am the creator. And whatever it is, like I still have to take at least 1 to 2 ballet classes a week in order to maintain my sanity. It's simple. And so that's my way of connecting as a performer. My way as an artist is by writing and working with other people. And so I have had to find in my own personal life the balance of it all. That I unfortunately need to be an octopus and do it all in order to maintain my center.
Being both producer and playwright definitely impacts my relationship to other playwrights. And we're a playwright-focused theater, and so we love playwrights, and we work with playwrights all the time. And, however, playwrights who don't have producing experience, I sometimes want to hit my head against the wall because you're trying to communicate. You know, I was on a panel at Chicago Dramatists of all of their affiliated playwrights, and it was 5 artistic directors, and one of the things I said was stop giving us so much power. Stop, running after artistic directors. And, I want you to see my script. I want self-produce. This entrepreneurial spirit. There's something to be said for that. If you really believe, and it's very hard, and it's very, there's all sorts of challenges, and it's. But sometimes if you have to get your voice out there, and there's only so many plays we can do. There's only so many projects, and so many projects are sent your way, and everything sounds great, and you'd love to be able to take everything on, but you just can't. I think artists approach the sector from this very disempowered place, oftentimes. Or I'm speaking for playwrights, let's say. So, there is something to be said for an entrepreneurial sort of drive in this sector, that we should understand that I know this is very cliche, but show business is a business.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by there are over 200 theater companies in Chicago. Most of them don't have the budget in a year that I usually spend on one program. But they produced some really amazing work. I mean, a couple of years ago, I saw a production called The History of America that was done by this group called Quest Theater, with puppets and muslin and pieces of cardboard that they cut to look like guns. That was really one of the most brilliant things I've ever seen. And they probably spent on that production less than I spend on food in a year to feed people as part of my job. But why is that art not seen as valuable or as professional and as worthy of financial support from organizations and non-profit funders as something that we do at the Goodman? Why do we not see the work that ETA has been doing in a community for years and years and years and years as important and as wonderful as the work that we do at an institution with the walls that we have?
I think we're starting to be low on time, so I'd like to make sure there's time to ask any questions people have. I think the last question I have for the panel is, I tend to be of the belief that the notion that all art is political is a cop-out, that it abdicates our responsibility as creators, as curators. But I'd love to hear from you guys why you think I'm wrong.
I think we've had this discussion before.
Or am I?
I think rock, paper, scissors. And again, I'm filtering through my own life experiences, but coming from a place where literally people will say on a daily basis, existence is resistance, again, it is a cop-out. It's like, well, no, that allows you to say, well, I got up and I went to school and not everybody, the U.S. government doesn't support me. I'm, in a minority, but anyone else who's like me, if you're, like all the, my best friend, it's like, well, by the time I'm 21, if I'm not in prison, I'm an anomaly because he was a young black man in Washington, D.C. So if by just simply thinking, okay, I've gone on and I've done it, it absolves you of the need to physically make change. And I think that where I would take issue with the idea that that simply just by doing theater is a political act. It's the only thing that's different is that you're removing the choice. You're saying that, well, I'm just here and I'm doing it, so I'm doing it. Rather than saying, I am doing this and I am conscious of it and I am choosing to acknowledge that element of it. It's not really quite as again, 250 characters or less, it wouldn't quite fit, but again, I think the biggest element of that is making conscious choices about it. Are you saying something directly, or are you saying my life in general is in that general sphere, so hence it's political?
What do you think?
First of all, it's how we define politics, and what is political, and are these electoral politics?
Yeah.
There are so many different levels. I think we own the word political with our work. It's very important to us to call the theater we do political theater. However, the risk of that is that it oftentimes gets labeled as not very good theater, or theater that you can dismiss. So the cop-out for me would be to not have a commitment to strong art and to quality art and to producing great theater. And I believe we've produced some great plays, and I'm proud of the work we've done from an artistic place. So I think that when and getting back to just like the funder conversation for a second, early on when we would meet with funders and talk about what we were doing, they'd say, well, that's not art, that's social work, or that's they would diminish, or that's sort of community service, or it's some other thing, and then we'd rattle off the names of artists we were working with and these great, but it's still
social service.
Yeah, so it was a way of pigeonholing and diminishing, and which is a political act in and of itself. Coming from the funders. So I think there can be a very nice marriage of the two. I think that there are days when we're much more wearing our artist hats than our activist hats, and vice versa. But I'd like to think that we're always cognizant of that relationship, and that they each fuel each other, the two.
What's your thought?
I think the making of art is inherently a political act, and political with a small p, art with a small a. That as artists, we tend to work from a place of curiosity and not judgment. That in itself makes us political animals to a certain extent. I think that the nature of creation, in the sense that we are looking for not the answers but the larger questions in the work that we try to do, sets us apart and different. Even when it is capital A or capital T theater, an artist goes into that, or a director will go into the selection of a play and the production of a play with a specific idea in mind, a specific message or question that he or she wants to explore, that so that they can take the audience on a journey with them. I don't think the rest of society kind of functions that way. I think we have been through the decimation of public education, through the proliferation of 24-hour news cycles that only look at things in sound bites, including the horrific tragedy in Colorado that happened. There is theater and art are the few places now where we actually want to dig deeper and look harder and view something from all sides, and I think that that's inherently cool.
I just feel, we all have gifts, and I'm not a comedian, but other people are. And my gift is that I am someone that can create theater that is about something. As much as I loved dancing the Nutcracker, it just didn't hit home to me. But I love it anyways. And I also feel that, you know, if somebody who is a baker decides to take a few acting classes or paints on the side, then that's wonderful. Because all of that is about self-expression. And I think that we've lost some of that in our society. And it is very rare for us to be doing what it is that we're doing and putting out ourselves and being vulnerable as artists to create from, you know, and talk about the world. And I think if we can just think about this more as just being a gift to communicate with, and then we all do get to change the world.
Does anybody?
I guess I had one last thing. Your capital and small letter thing kind of inspired and it's crazy too. I'm dyslexic, so I get crazy with the letters anyway, but I suppose maybe in some way, the way in which you are a dad, or I just became an aunt, so now suddenly I have this new little person who I've never quite loved any little person unconditionally the way I love my nephew. Now that like you are a dad or I'm an aunt, even though you might not, like you said, be wearing the dad hat, you are still always a dad, even when you're directing, even when you're taking public transportation.
You know, but it's the people doing it. Or how do we make the Nutcracker accessible to Orthodox Jewish and Muslim women performers? How can they be involved? How do we not make the whole second act ethno stereotypes done by white people? So we've done that. There was another piece, a photography exhibit from a man who had lost his wife to cancer, and it was actually torn down yesterday because the photography was too evocative, too hard to look at. But it was in a cancer ward, so the choir, all the other patients didn't want to look at that. So it's the choir looking at art themselves, and they're like, we don't want to face that. We just have pretty oceans. We want pictures of oceans. And so can we just have, where can art be an escape? Or, you know, is there a place to just do a nice Shakespeare play as a community, as a release?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about work that it has historic privilege. Then the Rogers Park community says they did a Nutcracker, and that says a lot to their neighbors and their community, versus they did an original ballet show.
And that's why I think the concept of balance comes into play. It's, you know, Jane Austen is equally as wonderful as, you know, people that talk about more things. I mean, all of her stuff is relationships, but relationships is the part of the whole. And so everything plays into it, and then self-expression, and all of that allows for different levels of thinking. And so I just think it has to be as part of the whole, you know, in my own thinking, finding the balance.
I can completely second that. You know, again, it's as a community, doing theater as a community would essentially, I mean, it's like, I think of it this way, and again, I do a lot of work with people who don't speak English as a second language, who don't speak English as a first language, so I do a lot of my examples physically, but the purpose for me of doing art is to walk as a community hand in hand. Now, often as the artist, you end up walking like this, and dragging and pulling other people, which is why especially people who work as conduits between the two different parts of the world are so important. I, as an artist, like I said, spend most of the time like this. I know a lot of other people in communities who, you know, spend their times like this. I lived across the street from a sheikh who every day I was aware of the fact that me not wearing, you know, appropriate dress was challenging to him, but also was maybe, you know, also just something like, oh, why can't she just, you know, make it easy? So again, being that you keep talking about, being able to exist on any numbers, but still keeping the connection is what's really important. Because if you run too far forward, and then you look back and tell everyone that they're jerks and they're ignorant for not keeping up with your art, like, you know, the Nutcracker is accessible to so many people. Whereas, you know, this strange avant-garde piece where you like sit in the middle of the stage and pour honey all over yourself and, you know, talk about menstruating will speak to one person and everyone else is going to go like,
And that's where I think finding your own voice as an artist is important. You know, I mean, and when I said, you know, I still need to go to ballet class every week, it's just because that's what helps me stay connected to what started me as an artist. But at the same time, the story that I like telling because of my background of growing up with a father who was terminally ill and a war veteran, I like to tell that story because that's what I'm good at. I'm not an improv artist. I am funny on my own being, but not on stage. You know, I don't have comic timing, and because I know that about me, it's not that I'm not trying to push my boundaries. I know the gift that I was given, and my gift that I'm given is to do what I'm doing right now.
So
I
just
love
about
the Nutcracker. In defense of the Nutcracker.
it's a great word.
I love the Nutcracker. I don't think the issue is that you can't have the Nutcracker. The issue is that people live in an environment and in a society where their choices are so limited that perhaps all they're getting is the Nutcracker, and so they never have an opportunity to see their stories reflected in the art form that I do. And that makes the problem. Not that the Nutcracker exists. I mean, the Nutcracker was the first ballet that I saw, ever. Now, I saw it with all white people. And usually that's always the way that you see the Nutcracker, but there is a beauty in appreciation of culture as a whole. It's the same thing in talking about polyculturalism as opposed to multiculturalism.
and it's a tradition. It's something, you know, I had no idea that there was this thing called Christmas, but I was cast in A Christmas Carol when I was 7 and told my mother, "Mommy, they're playing the soundtrack to our show," when we were in the shopping mall. So I knew that December was the time when they played this music. And that's something that unites us. And you know, my Russian friend who thought that all Americans liked t-shirts with animals on them, not understanding that these are sports mascots. So he got all upset. Because he was like, "What do you mean? I got a lion one. A lion would totally eat a dolphin. Why are you telling me the dolphin is good? I don't understand." And again, these are one of the awesome things about living in a really multicultural thing, but also having these polycultural things of like, I know what the Nutcracker is. There's a little girl, she falls asleep, the rats come, the Nutcracker's gonna come, he's gonna go kick ass, and then he's like gonna be this awesome prince. And what culture doesn't have this fantasy of like the beautiful girl falling asleep and the beloved uncle and being rescued? And these are things that both link us, and again, it's if we're only just doing the new stuff, we don't have tradition, which is hugely important. I mean, theater is such a ritualistic thing. I mean, anyone who's taken a theater history class has to study every single... This is the orchestra where the Greeks would sit, and there was one person, and...
There was theater, and then 1,500 years later, there was theater.
Yes.
1,500 years later, we have
And
theater.
only in parts of the world.
Yeah.
God knows, only in everywhere.
I think the problem is that when the Nutcracker is rendered inaccessible to people because of the cost, prohibitive cost of tickets or this kind of thing. It's the whole idea, like with great books, for example, or however you want to define canon, but not teaching working poor or working class kids that literature because the assumption is, it's not for them, or they're not going to somehow benefit from it.
Yeah.
So we're just about out of time, but I'd love if you guys would go through one by one and just say what projects you have coming up. What plugs do you have?
Ooh, cool!
Don't want to miss that part.
Well, we on August 9th are having our annual summer soiree. Tickets are $35 in advance, $40 at the door, and they go to support programming in Chicago Dance Theatre. So that's one little thing. We are actually currently also doing a residency down at the Chicago Cultural Center with Dance Bridge, and we're doing a showing on the 7th and 8th of August. And I am actually going back and exploring. Rumi is one of my favorite all-time poets, and last year in 2011 did a full-length work called Mirrors, using some of his poetry. And now I am re-examining other parts of Rumi's poetry and looking at the couplets to create a piece all about touch and how we physically touch one another, but also on the visceral level of touching each other. And I'm exploring a lot with what's going on with film and having film interacting with stage. And So that's one little component that will be going on. And then we also just received a grant from the Boeing Foundation to expand our Unraveling Bill project, which is about the piece I mentioned earlier about the soldier suicide. And we're going to be expanding that some more and doing some more performance with that. So it's a little bit of what we have going on. And all of our wonderful kids program. Space Camp ends next week, so.
I have three things that I'm really excited about. One, Monday night, we are doing a program called Soundtrack of the Movement, which looks at the influence of gospel and religious music on the civil rights movement. And that is the beginning of a year-long exploration that leads us into the 50th anniversary commemoration of the 63 March on Washington and the centennial of Bayou Rustin, who was the architect of that. So we are partnering with theater companies, which is why I want to talk to you and to you, from all over the city to sort of explore what the concepts, the themes, and the issues of that march mean in the 21st century in today, and also that march both in a historical context and as a progenitor of movements like the women's movement, LGBTQ rights, and as an example of the phenomenal fomenting freedom movements across the Middle East and Arab countries. So I'm very excited about that, which is a year-long project. On August 6th, the 80 kids that I've been working with for 6 weeks, devising a theatrical piece looking at the issues of fear and progress, will do their final performance. It's free at the Goodman, August 6th, Monday night, 7 o'clock. And then there is this incredible piece that we have been working with, actually, that you may be interested in. I'm a vet. We worked on a piece called Theater of War last year. It really allowed us access into veterans communities, and we are looking at developing a project to work with kids whose parents have been killed in action or killed while on deployment that we're doing with the USO that I'm really excited about.
August 3rd, 4th, and 5th, we are doing a series of readings of a smart, political, funny play called The Doctor is Indian by Shane Sakrani that looks at the effects of globalization on a family in India, in Mumbai, that's very much in flux and is sort of responding to globalizing influences. This fall, we are doing the Chicago part of a rolling world premiere of a play that we co-commissioned with two other theater companies, the LARP Play Development Center in New York and Golden Thread Productions in San Francisco, called Night Over Erzinga, which is a play that we've been living with for a while and are very much in love with. Adriana Saban-Nichols is the playwright. She's of mixed Armenian and Dominican heritage, and it's her family story. It's 3 generations. It starts with the Armenian genocide in Western Armenia in the early part of the last century, and brings us up to New York in the 1950s, and it's quite a story. And also Mosque Alert, our online project that I spoke about, and we encourage you to check that out, silkroadrising.org, and feel free to post and watch these videos and engage us, and you can even call us names. So, yeah.
What time is it? At 7:30 here, well, upstairs. We are doing a production of Two Dead Guys and a Banjo, directed by the one and only Tony Adams.
There's many Tony Adams.
There are. And that's part of the Halcyon Theatre's Alcyone Festival. It's in its 5th year, and this year it's focused on Mexican female playwrights. I'm also I'm hesitant to say it because actually I haven't said it out loud yet, but if I say it out loud, especially if there's a camera, people might hold me accountable. So I'm also currently writing a project which is education-based called Still Fnucking Dyslexic, flipping the U and the N, and working on getting that certified to be a continuing education, certified for continuing teachers education, and doing theater-based stand-up comedy and more visceral understanding of allowing teachers to understand what their learning disabled students are experiencing so that they can more easily interact with their students in the classroom.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Actually, I did just want to say, first of all,
Awesome.
thank you guys. I'm pretty honored that all of you guys are here today. So, and I think that there's some really amazing things that have come out of it. Please email us the projects that you just talked about, because we like to post them, let people know what's going on, just in case this takes a while to edit. And in addition, next Saturday at 2:30, we are doing another salon, I guess. It's going to be half performance and half panel discussion that is based around Latina artists in Chicago of all different disciplines. So we're in process right now of getting those artists, but we're hoping to have, finalizing them, but we're hoping to have someone from visual arts, from dance, from theater, from spoken word, and from music to perform bits of what they're doing right now, and also to do a panel like this. So come back 2:30, probably this room, I'm guessing, next week.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks.